Tyler didn't like it when people cried. Tears, the need to comfort someone, it always made him uncomfortable. He didn't know how to handle those moments. Not that he was an emotionless block of wood, it was just how he'd been raised. And 10 years of being a sheriff had left its mark. Over time, you stop reacting emotionally to a lot of things: blood, tears, tragedy. It's a defense mechanism. A bit of cynicism, a bit of detachment. It helped. Tyler also hated acting on impulse, but lately he didn't have much of a choice. "You're a goddamn idiot," the girl by the window said sharply, wiping her tears away with the sleeve of her shirt. She shot him a venomous glare before turning back to bandage her injured arm. There wasn't much blood left now. They were lucky. The wound wasn't deep. Why did you take so long to get here?" "Because you, lady, went exactly where I told you not to. A pack of werewolves isn't a bunch of playful pups. I already killed 3 of them. Be thankful your brother was gone by the time I showed up. As if I don't know that." Her cheeks flared red. "I couldn't just leave him there. Do you understand that or not?" Tyler sighed, shaking his head. He knew this wouldn't end well. Lara Forbes was too headstrong and stubborn for her own good. But he couldn't bring himself to refuse her. She was a damn good shot, and over time, they'd managed to work well together. But her sense of self-preservation? Practically non-existent. And now, as a result, she'd been bitten. Tyler had learned that werewolves were real 3 years ago, purely by accident. Rumors had started circulating about upright wolves roaming the local forest. Probably just kids playing a prank, dressing up for a dare. Still, he and the local ranger had decided to check it out. They found scraps of torn clothing at the spot where the wolf had supposedly been seen, but there was no blood or any other sign of an attack. Kids playing make-believe, it seemed. But they needed to be sure and catch the culprit before this dumb joke frightened someone. So Tyler set up a stakeout. The strange wolf showed up the very next night. A full moon illuminated its massive frame far too clearly. Tyler could see every hair on the creature's back. Its long limbs, tipped with claws as sharp as blades, only vaguely resembled human hands. The sight was unnerving. And when Tyler stepped out from the bushes and ordered it to put its hands up, the wolf growled and lunged at him. In seconds, Tyler was pinned to the ground. No, this wasn't some person in a costume. The beast snapped its jaws inches from his face. Somehow, Tyler managed to grab his gun and fire. The bullet grazed its clawed paw. The wolf yelped and leapt back, disappearing into the trees. Death had never felt closer to Tyler than it had that night. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing monsters were real. With that realization came problems. Tyler became a paranoid wreck. Warning signs were posted in the forest, but every wild animal attack now felt like the work of a wolf, a werewolf, with its grotesque, misshapen body and chilling snarl. Tyler went to the mayor hoping to get funding to install cameras in the forest, but his request was denied. Eventually, Tyler decided he'd had enough of sitting in his little office. He knew too much to let so many people remain in danger. People kept wandering into the restricted areas anyway. Something had to be done. So he relocated to a small police station deep in the woods. No one at the station knew his secret. Tyler's decision seemed perfectly logical for a sheriff, but in his talks with the ranger, it became clear the werewolf hadn't gone anywhere. It was just showing up more often in its wolf form than its upright one. Just a wolf, slightly larger than its kin. Maybe this was all in his head? But Tyler didn't give up and turned to the internet. He regretted it almost immediately. The sheer amount of conflicting information was overwhelming. Still, one thing was clear. Werewolves feared silver and holy water, and their bite turned others. It wasn't much, but it was a start. 2 months ago, I have to see my brother, don't you understand? The girl sitting across from him said firmly. The air in the office was stifling. The fan did little to combat the summer heat. Yet Lara Forbes shivered as if she were cold. Tyler understood but shook his head. No, ma'am. How did she think this would work? Her brother was locked up, at least in a cell. He couldn't hurt anyone. "Sheriff Beckett, don't you have family?" she pressed. "I'm so worried about him. He came out of the forest yesterday covered in blood, and this morning you—" She threw up her hands. "You arrested him. Riley wouldn't hurt a fly. He wasn't himself. Maybe he drank something. I don't know." "Oh no." Tyler knew the boy hadn't taken anything, unfortunately. But he wasn't about to tell Lara that. The truth was something she wouldn't believe. "Your brother killed a man," Tyler said bluntly. "The blood of Philip Richards, your neighbor, was found on his hands. That's it. Conversation over." And Riley Forbes had been naked, with no memory of what had happened, and last night had been a full moon. Classic. Lara scratched lightly at the edge of her bandage. The wound was already starting to heal. Her accelerated regeneration was kicking in, and the inevitability of her transformation terrified her. 4 days until the full moon. Great. She was in deep now. And Riley, he was somewhere out there in their den. Werewolves rarely lived alone. That much Forbes had learned. Whoever had turned her brother was calling to him, summoning him with some sort of pack instinct or shared consciousness. So now she and Sheriff Beckett knew where at least 5 wolves were hiding, one of them her brother. God. She could never bring herself to shoot him, to throw holy water on him, to watch him suffer in pain. "But he bit you," an inner voice hissed sarcastically. "You should never get too close to a predator." Lara pursed her lips. She couldn't help it. Back in their den, it had seemed, just for a moment, that her brother had recognized her. He didn't just shift during the full moon, and that was a problem. Maybe the other wolves had taught him something, but in his animal form, Riley was insane, as if he'd never been human. He would have torn her apart in seconds if Sheriff Beckett hadn't shown up, and now, at least, she was alive. Lara let out a bitter laugh. Well, too bad. She'd just have to live with it now. No other choice. "Thank you," she muttered begrudgingly, glancing sideways at the man. He merely nodded, and for a second she thought she saw a faint smile cross his face. Just like that other time. A month ago. "I'm telling you again, ma'am," the sheriff said tiredly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Your brother will remain in custody until—" "To hell with this," she snapped, her patience wearing thin. They'd been sitting here for almost an hour, and this damn cop had no real evidence. Nothing but the blood. On this tiny station in the middle of the woods, there weren't any other officers like there were back at the precinct. What the hell was he even doing holding her brother here? This couldn't be legal. You have no right to keep him here without a lawyer, you hear me? And I'll find the best one soon enough. She was making it up as she went, grasping at straws. In truth, Lara couldn't have afforded the best lawyer, even if she tried. And she wasn't exactly well-versed in legal jargon. She'd never wanted to be a lawyer like her mom. Maybe she would have been useful now. The sheriff's dark eyes seemed to darken even further as he spoke, his words sharp and deliberate. "Kid, you don't understand what kind of mess you're in. A murder. A lawyer won't help you." His voice dripped with disdain. "And if you start pushing your luck, I'll throw you in the cell next to him." The rage nearly took her breath away. Bastard. But she held back. It was a small town, and the sheriff held real power, second only to the mayor. His threats weren't empty. Damn it. "Let me talk to him," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. The damn sheriff hadn't let them see each other since the arrest. "You want to talk?" He raised an eyebrow. "Fine. Let's go." Just like that? Suspicion churned inside her. What if he really did throw her in jail? But after a brief moment of hesitation, she nodded. "All right, let's go." Riley was sitting in one of the cells, staring glumly at his hands. But as the sound of footsteps drew closer, he lifted his head. "Lara, how are you?" "I didn't do anything. Did anyone say you could talk?" the sheriff interrupted. Riley bristled. "What? I can't talk now, you jerk?" "You can when I say you can," the sheriff replied, dragging a folding chair over to the bars and nudging a bewildered Lara toward it. "Sit." The sheriff's roughness irritated her, but she couldn't afford to snap back. Lara took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. The sheriff didn't seem inclined to leave. He leaned against the wall behind her, idly spinning a pair of handcuffs on his finger. Strange man. "So, how are you?" she asked, striving to keep her voice as steady as possible. "Oh, you know, fine as much as I can be," Riley snorted. "The food here sucks, though." He glanced at the sheriff before turning his gaze back to her. "You'll get out of here, I promise. They don't have any evidence against you. They'll keep you here for a bit, then let you go." "You told them what you were doing that night, right? Nothing bad, right?" "I don't remember." A chuckle came from behind her, and Lara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "What?" she whispered, barely audible. "Impossible. I remember being at home, and then it was like someone called to me. It was so clear, I couldn't resist. And then, I remember sitting on the ground near Mr. Richards. There was blood everywhere, and I was naked." He shook his head, embarrassed. "Then I went back home, and there you were." The conclusion was obvious. "You didn't take anything, did you?" "No," Riley exclaimed, shaking his hands emphatically. "Of course not." "There were no drugs in his system," the sheriff muttered behind her. "Then I don't understand," Lara said, running her hand over her forehead, staring at her brother in confusion. "There's nothing to understand. That night was a full moon." "Bullshit," Lara shot up from the chair. "That's absolute bullshit. Do you even hear yourself? Are you trying to say he's a werewolf? Are you insane?" "It was a full moon," Beckett repeated, his voice flat. "Has he been attacked recently? By a wild animal in the woods, maybe? There's no sign of injury, but regeneration might have taken care of it." Lara stared at the sheriff, stunned. At first, she'd thought he was just an asshole. Now it seemed he was genuinely crazy. Silence stretched between them. The sheriff frowned darkly. "A day before, I was out jogging in the woods, and a wolf attacked me," Riley said suddenly, hesitantly. "Just a regular wolf. I managed to fight it off. It only scratched me a little. Nothing serious." "You didn't say anything," Lara exclaimed. "What if you have rabies?" "I told you it's nothing, just a scratch. No reason to say anything. Are you an idiot?" Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "Maybe I could have helped you." "No, ma'am," the sheriff said from behind her. "It wasn't a regular wolf, and there's nothing you could have done." "All right, time's up." His tone was firm as he grabbed her by the elbow. She didn't even have the strength to resist. Inside, she felt hollow, as if every emotion and thought had been drained out of her. The only thing left was a looping thought. "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real." "This can't be happening," she said quietly, as the sheriff led her out of the lower level, where the cells were, and toward his office. "You'd better accept that it is. There's a full moon next week. Come then, and you'll see for yourself." And so she came. Exactly 1 week later, Lara sat in the same chair opposite her brother's cell. The distance was wide enough that he couldn't reach her, but for some reason the sheriff had cuffed her to a pipe. "For your own good," he said when she protested, then left her to wait for whatever was going to happen. Through the barred windows, the full moon was visible, its cold light casting a thin strip on the cell floor. The absolute silence was broken only by Riley's labored breathing. He sat on the floor hugging his knees, occasionally muttering curses under his breath. It was clear he was in pain, his body trembling slightly. She couldn't just sit there. Lara tugged against the cuffs, wanting to go to him, to comfort him, but the metal held tight. Her wrist ached. "Riley, I'm here," she said, trying to steady her trembling voice. "It's going to be okay. You can get through this." A lie. How could she know that for sure? "Shut up," Riley growled, his voice low and unnerving. "Easy for you to say when it's not happening to you, huh?" Lara felt her heart leap into her throat. This wasn't her brother. It couldn't be him. He would never say something like that. But the tears spilled down her cheeks anyway. Riley sneered. "What? Can't handle the truth, bitch? You've always only cared about yourself. Always wanted to suck up to Mom and Dad, you lying piece of trash." He lunged at the bars, gripping them so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, Lara thought she saw the reflection of the moon in his wild eyes. She shook her head, unable to say a word. Right now, the only thing separating them was the corridor and the cell's bars. But Lara had the terrifying thought that her brother might just be able to tear them apart with his bare hands. Riley staggered back from the bars, whispering, "I'm sorry," before doubling over in pain. His body arched violently, hitting the stone floor as he convulsed. His arms and legs bent at inhuman angles, black claws sprouting from his fingers. Lara couldn't tear her eyes away. Everything was happening too fast. No time to process, no chance to convince herself it was all a nightmare. The creature behind the bars no longer resembled her brother. Standing on elongated, almost hairless legs was an enormous wolf, if you could even call it that. Its resemblance to a wolf ended with the elongated snout, grayish skin, and clawed paws. Lara pressed herself against the wall, afraid to even breathe. The monster stared at her unblinking with bright yellow eyes, unmoving. Lara lost all sense of time. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and everything inside her froze with terror. The wolf let out a deep guttural howl, lifting its snout to the ceiling. A second later, it lunged at the bars, claws raking against the cage. She prayed for the night to end quickly, or for that damn sheriff to come back and unlock her cuffs. She wanted to leave, to escape this living nightmare. But the handcuffs held tight. It felt as if Beckett were mocking her silently. "You're not going anywhere. You're going to watch." And she did. She couldn't even bring herself to close her eyes. The dawn came suddenly. Lara had stopped counting the minutes, her gaze now eerily calm as she watched her brother lying on the cage floor. The terror still gripped her, but there was something else now, a strange sense of inevitability, as if she had come to terms with it all. "Do you believe me now?" The sheriff's voice startled her, his hand landing lightly on her shoulder. She flinched. She nodded. She didn't have the strength to speak. The night had shattered her world, splitting it into before and after. Nothing would ever be the same again. "I'll make some coffee." She noticed the faintest smile on his lips. Wow, the sheriff knows how to smile. Riley was slowly coming to, glancing around awkwardly in search of clothes, though all that remained of them were tattered scraps. Beckett brought him a fresh set, and Riley dressed without a word, as if he no longer had the energy to argue. "I'll get you out of here," Lara whispered, the moment the sheriff left them alone and went upstairs. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but she was doing her best to hold herself together for her brother, for both of them. She couldn't leave him here, not after what she'd seen. "Do you have a plan?" Riley didn't sound very convinced. "Yes, I do," she lied boldly. "Anything to calm him down. I'll get on his good side and steal the keys. I'll unlock the cage, you'll see." It didn't sound half bad. "That's dangerous." "The sheriff's an asshole," Riley whispered cautiously. "I know," Lara said, slipping her hand through the bars to squeeze his. "And I'll be careful." She had to get him out. This was her fault. Lara had been the one to insist on moving here. They'd left their parents' home as soon as she turned 22. Riley was a year older, already in college, while she was just about to apply for a program in ornithology. Mount Lake, with its university and stunning forests, had seemed like the perfect place. She would never forgive herself. The office was dark. Beckett stepped aside to let her enter first, and Lara fumbled her way to a chair sitting on the very edge. A dim lamp flickered to life overhead. "Here," the sheriff said, sitting down at his desk. After rummaging through a drawer, he handed her a piece of paper. "Read this." He had abruptly switched to addressing her informally, but she pretended not to notice. Reluctantly, she glanced at the paper. It was an article from the internet about werewolves, how to kill them, what they feared, and how they transformed. Lara shivered, pushing the paper away. "I already get it," she murmured. The horror of the past night came rushing back so vividly, it felt like she'd never be able to look at her brother calmly again. She was still scared, terrified even. But the fear had sunk deep inside her, replaced by a strange numbness and resignation. The sheriff snorted. Shame you won't read it. Could come in handy since you're planning to live side by side with a werewolf." His calm tone made her skin crawl. "I am," she said, her voice firm, "but we'll figure something out. There must be a way to cure this. The man's expression grew serious again, and he shook his head. "There's no cure. This is for life. And now his life is going to be a hell of a lot longer than yours," he said, running a hand through his hair and exhaling sharply through his teeth. "Damn, kids. I didn't sign up to deal with this. What the hell were you all doing in that damn forest anyway?" He rose abruptly from his chair and began pacing the office. "My brother always ran there," Lara said, feeling a sticky, suffocating fear creeping over her. No, she couldn't befriend this man. She couldn't even try. "You promised your brother," a voice in her head reminded her. She ignored it as best she could. "And stop yelling at me," she added firmly. The pacing stopped. He was behind her now, and the sensation made her uneasy. "Who do you think those warning signs are for? Who do you think they're meant to protect? It's dangerous there, damn it. Every night I check the traps, and you people are out there jogging." His voice was tense again, and almost weary, but somehow that made it even more terrifying. He was like a wild animal himself, just not one that turned into a wolf. Lara swallowed hard and turned her head slightly. "You promised me coffee. I'll take a cappuccino." The sheriff sighed loudly enough to make her regret saying anything at all. "Black coffee only," he muttered, moving toward the coffee maker. Lara allowed herself a faint smile. "Fine. And while we're at it, tell me more about werewolves." She figured it couldn't hurt to feign interest, to lull him into a false sense of security. For the next hour, Lara peppered him with questions about werewolves and what to do about her brother. But her thoughts never strayed far from one singular goal. I have to get Riley out of here. A week of these conversations later, she finally executed her plan. She spiked the sheriff's coffee with sleeping pills, and once he was out cold, she took his keyring. The plan had seemed foolproof. If you can't help, at least don't make things worse. Lara had learned that lesson long ago back in grade school when she'd tried to stand up for her brother and they'd both ended up getting hurt. Mom had been furious, but Dad had hugged them warmly, telling them they'd done well to protect each other. Now, more than ever, she wished someone would hug her and tell her she was doing the right thing, because Lara wasn't so sure anymore. The old pickup truck screeched to a halt outside the police station, and Lara quickly ran up the steps. "Back already?" The man looked up from his computer. He must have seen her through the window. "What is it this time? A gun?" He spoke so calmly, as if he wasn't even angry with her. Lara bit her lip. "That would be helpful, I guess. But I came to apologize." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "And what do you want, Miss Forbes? Let me guess. You broke your brother out and now you're here to repent? Do you even know where he is right now?" Lara shook her head. Riley had transformed into that wolf-like creature and bolted into the dark forest the moment they'd left the station. She hadn't dared come back until the next day. Sheriff Beckett closed his eyes, rubbed his forehead, and spoke with a weary tone. "It's not your problem anymore, ma'am." The way he said ma'am made her wince. "I'm 22, you know," the sheriff snorted and waved her off. "Go home and stay out of the forest. Werewolves think like a pack. Your brother's probably far away by now, but there's still at least one wolf running loose in those woods. But I want to help." He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and said with icy finality, "I trusted you once. I won't make that mistake again. I know how to shoot." He crossed his arms, leaning toward her. "You don't quit, do you? You just love getting into trouble. Or maybe you're scared I'll shoot your brother, the one you let out. You couldn't keep him in that cage forever. Riley's good. He's a monster." Lara threw up her hands in frustration. "I'm not leaving until we find him. We can help each other." "Don't try to guilt me, kid," Beckett growled, stepping forward in a way that felt more threatening than anything he'd said. "He wouldn't have gotten out if you hadn't unlocked that cage. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me?" "I can be bait," Lara blurted, grasping at straws. "He knows my scent. You won't find him without me. "Shut up, you idiot," he snapped back. "You're not fixing anything, you're just making it worse." "Oh, really, Sheriff? You're such an ass." The room fell silent. They stared at each other, neither willing to back down. After a tense moment, Beckett spoke with clipped precision. "All you need to do is go home and keep your mouth shut. Leave the rest to me. Don't make me lock you up." She scoffed. "I wasn't planning to unless." In a split second, she stepped closer, her hand darting toward his holster. Before Beckett could react, she had the gun in her hand and jumped back, pointing it straight at him. "Either you help me, or I'll shoot." He froze, raising his hand slightly. His voice dropped, low and rough. "Put the gun down, Lara." His eyes darkened further, irritation radiating from him like an electrical charge. Lara already regretted what she'd done. Her finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. With a sudden lunge, Beckett grabbed her wrist, twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor. She struggled, but his grip was unyielding as he twisted her arm behind her back and pulled her firmly against him. She cursed under her breath. She'd been stupid to think this would work. His grip was like iron, and she knew bruises would follow. "Another stunt like that, and I'll lock you in a cell." "Got it?" he said firmly, his breath warm against her neck, sending an unwelcome shiver down her spine. She muttered something incoherent, resigned to her defeat. As her eyes roamed, trying to avoid his, she noticed the wall in front of her. A bulletin board held missing persons reports, newspaper clippings, printouts from the internet, and a map of the forest marked with red pins. Beside it hung a calendar, the full moon circled in bold red. "You're only looking for wolves?" "Not just wolves," Beckett replied, his tone weary. He released her and stepped back, holstering his gun. In a voice that was suddenly too formal, he added, "Go home, ma'am." There it was again. That ma'am. "No, I'm not leaving until you tell me everything," she said firmly, plopping down in the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. He raised an eyebrow, his tone almost surprised. "Stubborn." Tyler knew he shouldn't be telling her this. It would have been easier to think of her as a stereotypical young woman, naive and reckless. But Lara Forbes shattered every expectation. Yes, she was reckless at times, but she wasn't stupid. Hell, she'd been smart enough to drug him and steal his keys. Beckett was exhausted. The lies, the cover-ups, the destroyed evidence, the bribes. He was sick of it all. At the precinct, no one would have believed him anyway. His colleagues would have thought grief over his younger brother's death had driven him mad. But seeing Lara's desperation for Riley had stirred something inside him. Tyler had tried to save his brother Lawrence too, a year and a half ago. He'd failed. He couldn't keep this burden to himself any longer. He couldn't stay silent about what he'd seen. This knowledge could save someone's life, even this infuriating Miss Forbes. Carefully weighing his words, he told her everything he knew about werewolves, the hunt, and the other creatures he'd encountered over the past 3 years. For the first time in a long while, he felt a little lighter. "I make the silver bullets myself, mix the shavings into the powder. Wolfsbane's good to carry. It'll mask your scent for a while. Keep in mind, a werewolf might look like an ordinary wolf, just bigger. I've never seen a wolf." "Only in pictures," Lara admitted with a sigh, biting her lip. Much of what she'd just heard, Lara already knew, but the stories about ghosts and vampires left her stunned and terrified. Still, she took solace in the fact that Riley had gotten off relatively easy. At least, he was alive, if you could even call that living. "Otherwise, they're just wolves," Beckett continued. "They respond to howls, they don't live alone, and they follow a pack leader. Your brothers probably joined one by now. The question is, which one, and where are they?" He glanced at her. "I'm checking the traps tonight. Come with me since you're so keen to help." His voice was calm, as always, but there was a faint smirk on his lips. Lara nodded with determination. "Of course. Just give me a gun. I'm not going out there unarmed." A couple of hours later, they met at the station. Lara sipped her cold beer, savoring it. She'd picked it up on the way, needing something to steady her nerves. Beckett glanced at her, shaking his head in mild disapproval. "We're here," he said abruptly. He unfolded a map on the hood of his truck, licked the tip of a pencil, and marked a spot. Lara found herself staring at the gesture longer than she should have. Shaking her head to clear it, she refocused. "The traps are set along these trails," Beckett said, pointing to the map. "You're coming with me, but first." He handed her a shotgun. "Show me how you shoot. You don't believe me? You could have lied. I need to know for sure." She scoffed, taking the shotgun and walking a few steps away. Propping a bottle on a fallen log, she backed up, took aim, and fired. The bottle shattered into tiny shards. A flock of birds burst from the bushes in a black cloud. Beckett gave a nod of approval and handed her a couple of silver-loaded shells. "Stay close. I want to make sure you don't shoot me in the back." "Paranoid much?" she muttered, rolling her eyes, but kept pace with him. The forest greeted them with an oppressive silence. Not even birdsong broke the stillness, as though all sound had been swallowed up, leaving them in a vacuum. Lara shivered as a cold breeze swept over her, or perhaps it was the eerie quiet that made her skin crawl. Adjusting her grip on the shotgun, she glanced around nervously before speaking. "Have you ever told anyone about werewolves?" "No one's ever asked," Beckett said indifferently, keeping his eyes forward. "And if they had, I wouldn't have told them." "But you told me," she said with a small, self-satisfied smile. "I had no choice. Otherwise, you wouldn't have believed me. I had a brother too. I understand your concern." They walked a few more yards before he added, "First trap's up ahead." Without looking at her, he quickened his pace. Lara wanted to ask more, but bit her tongue, following close behind. The canopy of leaves above was so thick it blocked out the sky. The only light came from the flashlight in Beckett's hand, illuminating the narrow path ahead. She began to relax slightly, convincing herself that nothing would happen tonight. And then she heard the snap of a branch up ahead. In the flashlight's beam, a figure appeared. A wolf, but not an ordinary one. This creature was just like Riley. Huge, with an elongated snout and sparse fur covering its hunched back. Lara froze for a second, her mind blanking out. What if it's him? Her breath caught as fear took hold, and all rational thought evaporated. She simply stared at the animal that had appeared so suddenly. "Is that Riley?" she whispered. She squinted, trying to make out the details. No, this one seemed larger. But how could she be sure? "No." "Shoot," Beckett said through clenched teeth. She barely managed to raise the shotgun. The wolf bared its teeth, growled low, and crouched to the ground before leaping toward them. For a split second, the world seemed to stop, and then she pulled the trigger. Her aim was true. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder. It collapsed to the ground with a pained whine, its massive back arching in its death throes, before going still. "Didn't think I'd run into one so soon," Beckett muttered, watching as the beast transformed into a man before their eyes. Lara lowered the shotgun slowly, her hands trembling. Relief washed over her. It wasn't Riley. Her fists clenched unnoticed in an attempt to steady herself. "Did you know him?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "No," Beckett replied, shaking his head. "Doesn't seem local. That was a transitional form. Looks like he didn't finish the shift." "I killed a person," the thought struck her belatedly, but she shoved it aside. Not a person, a dangerous monster. Perhaps this was the one who'd bitten Riley. There was no room for pity. But something inside her changed that night. 2 months earlier, shortly after Riley was imprisoned, when Lara entered the living room, Emma Birkenbridge was taking a selfie in front of a mounted deer head on the wall. "Did you buy this cabin from a hunter?" "Ugh, how cringe," she sneered. "How am I supposed to order makeup for reviews here? Do couriers even deliver this far out? Riley's girlfriend was supposed to live with them for at least a year while he saved up to buy a house. If you don't like it, go back to Chicago." "No one's stopping you," Lara retorted, setting a tray on the coffee table with 2 glasses of iced tea, some fruit, and strawberry ice cream, Emma's favorite. The gesture was purely for appearances. "Ugh, this place is such a dump," Emma groaned, sinking onto the couch and reaching for a drink. Lara bit back a remark. Emma was as insufferable as they came. yet they were stuck living together for the foreseeable future. Lara couldn't fathom what someone so polished and vain had seen in her brother to make her leave everything behind and move to the middle of nowhere. She didn't believe in their so-called love. When Riley ended up in jail, Emma hadn't lifted a finger. She hadn't gone with Lara to talk to the sheriff or done anything useful. Still, to her credit, she asked about Riley's condition regularly. That was something, at least. The night was dark and stifling. Lara tossed and turned on her side of the bed, unable to fall asleep. Grim thoughts about the future crowded her mind, refusing to let her relax for even a moment. She turned her head. The sheriff lay on his side of the bed, sound asleep. It seemed she would be the only one suffering tonight. Lara listened to her body, searching for any new sensations, but there was nothing. It felt as if nothing had changed. The wound on her arm had already healed, and out of boredom she began carefully unwinding the bandage, trying not to wake Beckett. If someone had told her a month ago that she'd end up sharing a bed with a man old enough to be her father, she'd have told them to shut the hell up. Truth be told, it had been her idea that Beckett not sleep on the floor. If they'd been given a room with 2 single beds, it would have been easier. But as luck would have it, all the rooms were booked. No way was she going to tell Emma about this. Emma had already started asking where Lara disappeared to every weekend, and Lara had come up with the dumbest excuses, working late shifts at a nightclub, which Emma, of course, immediately wanted to visit because she knew people, or rescuing lost pets, which probably sounded even less believable. Lara dropped the discarded bandage onto the floor and stared blankly at the ceiling. In the dark, she imagined shadows, ghosts of those they'd killed standing by the bed, whispering her name in hushed voices. Or perhaps it was the bite's influence, the friends calling to her. Either way, it was horrifying. Was one of those voices Riley's? She was afraid to close her eyes, afraid to face the black void of the night. They appeared to her as if real. A little girl, a vampire, who had killed her entire family. Further off, a man who'd gotten lost in the woods and turned into a pale crawler. She remembered his photo in his family's house, a silent reminder that he had once been human. In the corner, a werewolf boy, head hunched low, who had attacked his girlfriend in a fit of rage. And then there was the demon-possessed mother, long dead by the time they'd arrived, but still. God, they'd killed so many in just 1 month. I don't kill people, she reminded herself sharply, but it didn't stop her from feeling as if the ghosts were staring at her with reproach and disdain, calling her, accusing her. And they had reason. She had taken their lives, not Beckett, her. Lara covered her face with her hands, pressing her palms hard against her skin. Lara, monster slayer, or is it people? Forbes. She gave a bitter smile. Now, it was more like Lara, cursed werewolf Forbes. A week ago, when they'd been tracking a werewolf near Riverside, she'd slept like the dead. But now, these damned thoughts. Beckett was asleep on the other side of the bed, maintaining a respectable distance. Lara, still restless, turned toward him, mindlessly studying his face. It was strange, but it beat thinking about her bleak future. The ghosts seemed to retreat, at least for now. They left the motel early in the morning without even bothering to eat breakfast. Lara hadn't slept at all, so she hoped to doze off in the car. They needed to get back to town as soon as possible. No one knew when her transformation might begin. It could happen before the full moon. They stopped at a diner along the way. Beckett ordered himself coffee and a slice of pie, while Lara went for spicy wings, a burger, and a soda. Her appetite was ravenous. If this was a sign of the coming transformation, it was bad news. Why hadn't she asked Riley more questions? Maybe then things would have been easier now. Beckett watched her grimly, saying nothing. He was sure the sudden hunger was one of the symptoms, but that wasn't the only reason he kept looking at her. There was something else, something he refused to admit to himself. Brave, yes. Reckless, definitely. The kind of person they called foolhardy. All right, maybe not foolish. But reckless? Plenty of that to go around. The sauce from her burger dripped down her hand, and Lara laughed. "Damn it," she said, licking the sauce off her fingers. Beckett tried to maintain a neutral expression, but it wasn't easy. Is she starting to grow on me? Not as a partner, but as a woman? She's half my age. What the hell is wrong with me? He threw her an inscrutable look. Damn troublemaker. Did she think he didn't notice? The teasing names, the constant jabs. If she was trying to flirt with him, it wasn't going to work. He'd already decided that she'd spend the next few days locked up until the full moon passed. It was the only way. She'd understand, or she wouldn't. Not his problem. She'd gotten herself bitten through her own stupidity. Now she'd have to deal with the consequences. But if it weren't for you and your damn hunt, she wouldn't have been bitten, a voice in his mind whispered. He sighed heavily. The guilt over Lawrence's death still haunted him. And now this. He'd failed as a big brother once. He couldn't let it happen again. You always wanted to be a cop? Her voice broke through the tension in his thoughts. Beckett looked up at her. She was enthusiastically finishing off the last wing. Yeah. Why do you ask? Just curious. Am I not allowed to be? She said with a smirk. He shrugged. What about you? What are you studying? Ornithology, she replied eagerly. I'm about to apply. I used to want to be a vet. I've always loved animals, but I couldn't stand to see them in pain. But you'd be saving them, he said thoughtfully. And what if I couldn't? She bit her lip, looking at him seriously before letting out a wry laugh. I wouldn't last long. It seemed like she wanted to say something more, perhaps something along the lines of, and now people are dying because of me. Lara had expected Beckett to drive her home, but the truck kept moving further down the road. Where are we going? She asked cautiously. The sheriff didn't answer. He'd always been too quiet, a trait she'd come to understand over the past month when they'd been forced to spend more time together. His lack of overt emotion didn't bother her. She had friends, her brother, and even Emma for that. With Tyler, it was different. They were partners of a sort. When the truck turned toward the police station, realization struck her. He was planning to lock her up just like he'd done with Riley. What an asshole. They climbed out of the truck. Are you going to explain yourself? I'm not going anywhere, she said, stopping in her tracks with what she hoped was a convincing show of defiance. We don't know when it'll start, Beckett said with a sigh. For now, you're staying here. I didn't want to do this, but it's safer for everyone. And how long will I be locked up? Like Riley? A few months? Or until you get bored? 4 days. Until the full moon. Unless he trailed off, his tone warning. Unless I don't try to escape, you mean? She shot back with a mocking smile. What? You enjoy throwing your weight around, officer? He didn't answer, instead nudging her toward the stairs. Get moving. That's your room for the foreseeable future, Beckett said as he unlocked the cell door and held it open for her. Lara flinched. What? And if I don't go in? You'll shove me in, Sheriff? She asked, her voice a mix of irritation and mockery. Yes, came the blunt reply. With a displeased huff, she stepped into the cell. Resisting was pointless. Beckett locked the door with a click. You've got to be kidding me, she muttered, glaring at him. What about my things? She asked, her voice sharp. I'll bring what you need. Hand over your keys, he said, extending his hand through the bars. He's not kidding. Lara sighed, resigning herself to defeat. At least Emma was out of town. She wouldn't have to explain any of this to her. Still, the idea of Beckett rummaging through her personal items was far from appealing. No way was she spending 4 days in the same outfit. Digging into her pocket, she handed over her keys. Here, she said, tossing them onto his palm. Whatever you see, don't make a big deal about it, okay? Beckett frowned. Got something to hide? Illegal substances? She rolled her eyes. More like intimate things, officer. Like what? He asked with an annoyingly straight face. Is he serious? Oh, for God's sake. You're so perceptive, aren't you? She groaned. Just move my truck while you're at it, will you? He was gone for nearly an hour. Lara paced the cell restlessly, her anxiety mounting. Fear gnawed at her insides as images of Riley, trembling on the floor of his own cell, filled her mind. I don't want this. I can't. It's always my fault. Everything's my fault. Frustration boiled over, and she slammed her fist against the cot. Where the hell is that damn cop? The sound of the door unlocking broke her thoughts. Insults hovered on the tip of her tongue, but instead she opted for sarcasm. Wow, that was fast. Barely took you a year. Beckett placed a neatly folded pile of clothes on the floor and slid it toward her. At the top of the stack was a plain dark shirt with the county name faded across it. The clothes weren't hers. "Whose are these?" Lara asked, crossing her arms and stepping back from the pile. "Mine," Beckett said calmly. "I suggest you change now." "And why didn't you grab my clothes?" A crazy woman at the house started screaming about police brutality and threatened to sue me. Didn't seem interested in hearing my explanation. "Emma," Lara smirked. "Well, here's hoping I don't drown in them." She picked up the clothes and laid them out on the cot, inspecting the shirt. The lettering on the front, Mount Lake, was so faded it looked like it had been washed dozens of times. At least everything was clean, not the worst option. The key clicked in the lock, and she turned around. Beckett stood on the other side of the bars, locking her in. "Hey, what the hell?" she shouted, tossing the shirt back onto the cot and planting her hands on her hips. "You know I'm not going to run," she said, her frustration boiling over. Beckett looked at her thoughtfully and shook his head. "I know, but you're just a paranoid control freak, huh?" "Orient, I'll take you to the shower in an hour," he interrupted, turning on his heel and heading toward the stairs without another word. "What the hell are you doing?" she yelled after him. No answer. Lara thought it couldn't get any more awkward. She was wrong. The shower. She'd hoped Beckett would let her shower in peace, maybe grab some coffee and donuts like cops in movies, and talk to her like a decent partner. Yeah, right. Keep dreaming. Instead, he loomed nearby. Sure, he was a few yards away behind a corner, but that didn't make it any less uncomfortable. A near stranger, potentially watching her shower? The thought made her cringe. She scowled. What if he's some creepy old perv? Old, how old is he anyway? 45? Great. Practically her dad's age. The warm water began to cool and she grimaced, reaching for her towel. "All done?" Beckett's voice came from beyond the divider. "Apparently the hot water only lasts 5 minutes, she grumbled. He sighed heavily, the sound carrying annoyance. Of course, he's not the one freezing his ass off. The towel was rough, scratching her skin as she dried off and began to dress. The pants were slightly too big, and she had to tighten the drawstrings. Finally, she called out, "Ready!" Beckett stepped out from the hallway, gave her a quick once-over, nodded, and motioned her to go ahead of him. "At least you're not cuffing me," she muttered as they returned to the cells. "No," he replied flatly, "but I'll bring you some coffee." Lara smirked. Well, at least something good came out of the day.